Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Tony is in Fareham. Let's come back to your views just before we have the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace in position. Tony in Fareham, it's the question, yes or no to the no-fly zone over Ukraine. What say you? Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Nick. Definitely not. At the moment, the Russian Air Force has been very sort of limited in its attacks on Ukrainian soil. There could be a number of reasons for that. Maybe the pilots don't want to know. Maybe there's indecision. I don't know. But what I think the West should be doing, along with supplying anti-tank weapons, is drones, which can be controlled from miles and miles away from the other side of the world, to be perfectly honest with you. You've heard a lot about anti-tank weapons, but
yes.
Drones may be the answer.
Thank you for that, Tony. I'm going to finish there, sorry, because I think I can get, and I'm grateful for your input, sir, and I will mark your vote down, but I think I can now turn to Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, who joins me. First question, Secretary of State. This time yesterday, there was a 40-mile convoy of Russian vehicles stopped about 20 miles from Kyiv. As we understand it, it's still stopped 20 miles from Kyiv. Why? Good morning.
Good morning. Well, I think, as I'd said, I think in one of your earlier shows, the planning assumptions that Moscow made that that they would be welcomed with open arms by Ukrainians being liberated by the great sort of Russian leadership meant that they made all sorts of decisions that you wouldn't have made if you took a view that the Ukrainians were actually going to fight. So they trundled off down in a line with a big armoured column. I think they presumed they would take these cities in. Well, we know their battle plans were sort of clearly aimed at doing it in a few hours or days rather than a week. That means you start to run out of logistics. When I was a soldier, you might be given 5 days rations, and that's great if you're resupplied in day 3, but suddenly you end up running out of rations, running out of fuel and petrol. So what's happened is that their supply chains are stretched. The Ukrainians have been putting up fierce resistance. They've blown up bridges. Suddenly they can't go very far. The Ukrainians, despite the efforts, the Russians are still managing to fly aircraft and UAVs and are hitting supply chains in the rear. And so they are finding it much harder going. It hasn't really moved very far from where you saw it yesterday.
So it is an issue of supply, Secretary of State, effectively an issue of supply.
That's one of the reasons. Supply and brave resistance around Kiev.
OK. On to other matters. You'll be aware that the Prime Minister was upbraided by an anti-corruption activist yesterday who said, quotes, NATO is afraid of World War III, but it's already started in Ukraine. She went on to say why NATO won't enforce a no-fly zone. Secretary of State, why?
Well, I think there are two reasons. First and foremost, Ukraine isn't in NATO. And NATO is a self-defense organization that if you attack one of us, you attack us all, and we effectively all go to war under Article 5. So even if that is, if you attack Estonia, Britain, the United States, Canada, France and Germany will come to the rescue of Estonia. If we had a no-fly zone, it has to be enforced because the Russians wouldn't play by the rules. We know that pretty much from their track record. So they would then find themselves with either British or German or French fighter jets shooting down Russian aircraft. That would trigger an Article 5 response if the Russians attacked us back, which they no doubt would, and then you would have war right across Europe. I think there's a second thing, which is about the military point, which no one seems to really have debated, and it is partly debatable, but at the moment, with a vastly sort of superior in number Russian armed forces on the ground, one of the few weapons the Ukrainians have to take them on in depth, as we say, so not just on the front line but going after the logistics, etc., is the air. They can use either aircraft or indeed UAVs to do that. If you have a no-fly zone, that includes both sides. That would favour the Russian ground forces, and they would suddenly be able to that armoured column would probably start moving a bit quicker. And secondly, what you would also see is, Russia has lots of stocks of missiles which can reach and replace fighter jet attacks. So they would carry on heavy bombardment, long-range missile strikes, and there's nothing we could do about it. And the Ukrainians would have very little options in return. So I don't think it stacks up militarily at the moment. And I don't think it stacks up if you want to avoid this war in Ukraine spreading to the rest of Europe and Britain.
A question, Secretary of State, from Joy in Northampton. Ask the Secretary of State, is he afraid of Putin?
I'm not afraid of Putin.
Why are we not taking more direct action then?
Well, I don't want a war across the whole of Europe. Ask your callers, do they want a nuclear armed Russia to be at war with all of us across Europe and Atlantic?
But we hear reports, Secretary of State, and this will trouble you as much as it does me, that orphanages now have been bombed, hospitals are being targeted, as well as schools, and the West continues with sanctions, continues to rally, but effectively looks on. So I say again, is the West scared of Vladimir Putin?
No, I think the reality is the West has NATO predominantly as its main self-defense organization. I said weeks ago that the reality is that, we wanted Ukraine to join NATO back, a few years ago. Britain was one of the lead sponsors or supporters of them getting into NATO. You have to have all 30 members to let them in. That hasn't happened. We've trained 20,000 Ukrainians since 2015 to get them up towards that standard and to help them come in. But the simple matter of fact is they're not in NATO when Russia invaded them. If they were in NATO, do I think Russia would have invaded them? I don't think so. But they're not. And that is, look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We are going to see President Putin, who has done things that nobody logically would have done. He didn't need to invade Ukraine. He didn't need to do what he did in 2014-15. He doesn't need to brutalize the population. Anyone who thinks logically would not do what he is doing. So we are going to see, and I have to, your listeners are going to see this, his brutality increase. He doesn't get his way. He surrounds cities. He ruthlessly bombards them at night. As we've seen, they've been pummeled, some of these cities. And he will then eventually try and break them and move into the cities. He hasn't been successful in the last 7 days. He's taken lots and lots of casualties. I think he's made some really big errors, but that is the reality. Now, I'm not going to risk war in Britain and Europe, I'm afraid, at this moment in time by triggering a direct conflict with Russia. That is why he's probably doing it, because he knows Ukraine is not in NATO. He wouldn't do it with with the Baltic states. And that's why we are reinforcing the Baltic states to send a very clear message.
Let me ask you then, if you're not afraid of Putin, what is your view of him?
I think President Putin is currently invading a sovereign country. He doesn't seem to think that the international rules or law apply to him. He doesn't seem to have any regard for human life. And he is ruthlessly expanding his ambitions. It doesn't sort of matter what I sort of think of him as a person or anything else. I don't think throwing personal insults will make, but I think he has definitely acted in a very reckless and illogical manner. And the cost is being borne not just by Ukrainians, it's being borne by Russian mothers and Russians whose children are either disappearing because there's not much freedom of press at the moment in Russia, and there are all sorts of things going on, suppressing people who protest in that country. We should worry overall that the direction of travel of Russia seems to be happy to be in an isolation, which it's going to be after this, no matter what happens, and has no regard for human rights or the individuals, which is actually one of his mistakes, because that is why people in Ukraine, even though they shared a common history on and off over hundreds of years, even though they fought as the Soviet Union in the Second World War, that is because they recognise that individuals and their rights matter, and that the state that they create should look after them.
How long is this likely to go on, Secretary of State?
I wouldn't like to predict, Nick. The Russians would have thought a few weeks ago that this would have lasted a few days, and then a sort of longer extended period while they sort out the population, which probably would be quite a creepy manner of, denazifying, as they called it, which has all sorts of connotations. But I think they would have presumed that the battle phase would have been a few days. The sort of occupying, where they put in puppet government, would have taken a couple of 3 or 4 weeks. I think this is going to take a very, very long time. And I think, the lessons for everyone are in history. Chechnya, the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. Invading's easier bit. The hardest bit is occupying. We learned that as a coalition in Iraq. And remember, in Iraq, a large part of the population did want us there. And it still meant that we lost a few hundred people as a coalition invading Iraq. We lost thousands in the following 10 years occupying Iraq. Well, imagine what that's like in a country with Ukrainian fighters, 44 million people, well supplied with defensive equipment, and none of them want you there. So that's where Russia will pay the price.
So lastly, we're not just looking at weeks, we're looking at months. We might be looking at years.
You'll be looking at years of Ukrainian resistance.
Grateful for your time as ever, Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, appearing here on LBC, where at 8 o'clock the news is read by Holly Harris.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Ukraine's second largest city of Kharkiv has come under fire this morning with missiles.